In a remote monastery hidden deep within the highlands of Ethiopia, an aging monk spent his final days guarding a secret he believed the world was not ready to hear. For decades, he had studied ancient texts, manuscripts older than most known versions of the Bible, writings preserved in isolation, untouched by time, translation, or empire. And according to him, these texts contained something extraordinary. Not just the story of Jesus' resurrection, but words, alleged final teachings that were never meant to leave those sacred walls. On his deathbed, the monk made a choice. He revealed what he believed were the true words of Jesus after the resurrection, teachings recorded in the Ethiopian Bible, a version far older and far less known than the ones followed by billions today. What did he say? Why were these words hidden? And what do they reveal about faith, truth, and the story we thought we already knew? Today, we uncover the mystery buried for centuries, a revelation that could challenge everything. This is the untold story of what Jesus may have said after he rose. To understand what that monk was protecting, you first need to understand just how different the Ethiopian Bible actually is. Most people grow up believing the Bible is fixed, final, and untouchable, as if it fell from the sky in its current form. But the Ethiopian Orthodox Church never agreed with that version of history, and they have the receipts to prove it. While the Western Bible was standardized at 66 books, Ethiopia preserved 81. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, and Maccabees, texts that were used by early Christians, revered by ancient Jewish communities, and then quietly dropped from the Western canon. For centuries, Western scholars dismissed them as myths, forgeries, or dangerous distractions. Then science stepped in. Radiocarbon dating of the Garima Gospels, discovered inside an Ethiopian monastery, confirmed they were written between 330 and 650 AD, making them the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts ever found on Earth. While Europe was burning through the Dark Ages, Ethiopian monks were preserving Christianity's original source code, untouched, unedited, and unapproved by Rome. And what's inside those extra books is not gentle Sunday morning reading. The Book of Enoch doesn't just say humanity sinned before the flood, it explains why. It describes a cosmic breach, 200 watcher angels who descended to earth, took human wives, and produced hybrid beings called the Nephilim, giants who consumed the world's resources and unleashed chaos on civilization. The book names Samyaza, Azazel, Barakiel. It says these beings taught forbidden knowledge to humans, weaponry, seduction, astrology, things that were never meant to be revealed. This wasn't simple disobedience, it was an unauthorized transfer of power. That's exactly why Rome rejected it. The world Enoch describes is chaotic, untamable, and impossible to control through institutional religion, so it was removed. Ethiopia kept it. And Enoch, as explosive as it is, was just the opening act, because the real shock, the thing that monk was whispering about on his deathbed, is a text called the Mashafa Kedan, the Book of the Covenant. And what's written inside it rewrites everything you thought you knew about the resurrection. What Jesus said during the 40 days in the standard Gospel of Luke, the period between the resurrection and the ascension, is handled in a few brief verses. Jesus appears, blesses the disciples, and rises into the sky, 40 days condensed into a paragraph. But in the Ethiopian Mashafa Kedan, those 40 days are the main event. According to this text, the risen Christ doesn't just comfort his disciples, he gathers them with urgency. Like a general giving a final briefing before leaving a battlefield, and he begins to teach them things that were never recorded in any Western gospel. He starts with a warning about the material world. He calls it the playground of a deceptive force, a builder of shadows, an entity that uses wealth, status, and power to keep human beings spiritually blind. And then he says something that should have been the most famous line in all of Christian history. Do not build temples of stone, for the stone will crumble. Build the temple of the heart, for it is eternal. In the context of this text, that is not a metaphor, it is a direct command. He is warning them explicitly against organized religion. He predicts that men will wear long robes and invoke his name to accumulate gold. He warns against a future empire that will take his cross and turn it into a sword. The specificity of it is what unsettles scholars most. It reads as if he is standing 2,000 years in the future, watching the Crusades unfold, watching the Inquisitions, watching televangelists fill arenas while the poor go hungry outside. He tells them plainly, the true believer must be a stranger to the systems of men. But the warning doesn't stop there. He introduces something that sounds almost scientific in the way it describes the human soul. He says, every human being has two winds moving through them simultaneously, the wind of life and the wind of error. And the wind of error, he explains, isn't simply bad intentions or sinful thoughts. He describes it like a parasite with specific entry points. It enters through greed. It enters through the eyes when they look at what they shouldn't. It enters through the mouth when it speaks deception. And once it takes hold, it doesn't just make you worse, it calcifies the heart. It turns a living, breathing human being into what he calls directly a walking tomb. Think about that phrase for a moment. A walking tomb, a person who eats, sleeps, works, scrolls through their phone, but whose inner life has already gone cold, a spiritual zombie. He wasn't describing fiction. He was describing a condition he believed was already spreading. And then he gives them the antidote, not a sacrament, not a ritual, not a financial offering to a temple. He calls it gnosis, knowledge, direct internal personal knowledge of truth. He teaches them to observe their own thoughts the way a guard observes a city gate, watching what enters and what exits. And then he says the line that would have dismantled the entire structure of institutional religion if it had been widely published. He says, the kingdom of heaven is literally inside the human body, hidden in the silence between thoughts. This is why that text had to be suppressed. If the average person in the Roman Empire believed that God lived inside them, they would stop paying taxes to the temple. They would stop fearing the bishop. They would stop needing an institution as their intermediary with the divine. They would become, in the language of the empire, completely uncontrollable. But Jesus didn't stop at spiritual instruction. He also said things that centuries later modern science would quietly confirm, science hiding in ancient text. The Book of the Covenant contains cosmological details that were, for most of history, dismissed as poetic nonsense. He speaks of the storehouses of snow and the gates of the winds, describing weather as something that moves through structured channels and follows invisible pathways across the planet. For centuries, this sounded like mythology. Modern meteorology now confirms that global weather patterns travel in defined atmospheric rivers, literal rivers of wind circling the Earth at high altitudes. How does a 2,000-year-old text reference the atmospheric dynamics of the planet? He also speaks of a great abyss of water hidden beneath the Earth's surface, again dismissed as symbolism until 2014, when scientists announced the discovery of a massive reservoir of water locked inside ringwoodite rock deep within the Earth's mantle, holding more water than all of the planet's surface oceans combined. The abyss was real. The Ethiopian Bible was right, and if these texts were accurate about the water beneath us and the rivers of wind above us, the question that logically follows is impossible to ignore. What else were they right about? He also left the disciples something more than words. According to the Mashafa Kedon, he shared a specific practice, a secret discipline known only to those in the inner circle, involving the deliberate control of breath and the focused direction of thought. It reads almost identically to advanced contemplative practices documented across India, Tibet, and the Eastern traditions. This connects to one of the most persistent theories in biblical archaeology that Jesus spent his so-called lost years, the gap between age 12 and 30 that the Gospels never explain, studying in the monasteries of India or the learning centers of Tibet. The teachings recorded in the Ethiopian Bible are strikingly Eastern, concepts that resemble karma, reincarnation, inner energy centers, all present, all framed in the ancient language of the text. And then he says the line that ties everything together, the line that monks have been memorizing and protecting for 2,000 years. He looks at his disciples and tells them, "The darkness will come, and it will wear my face. It will wear my face." He is not warning them about an obvious monster. He is warning them about a deception so sophisticated that it would look exactly like him. It would speak his name, carry his cross, build cathedrals in his honor, and be the precise instrument of the spiritual destruction he spent his life opposing. The Antichrist in this text doesn't arrive as a villain, it arrives as a savior. And the Ethiopian monks who guarded this passage believed with absolute conviction that it was not a future prophecy, it was a description of something already in motion. And the proof that Ethiopia took all of this seriously isn't just found in manuscripts, it's carved into the landscape itself. The Ark of the Covenant. You cannot tell this story without addressing the single most powerful object in biblical history and Ethiopia's very specific claim to it. While Hollywood placed the Ark of the Covenant in a government warehouse in New Mexico, Ethiopia has maintained for 3,000 years, without wavering, that the Ark is here, locked inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the ancient city of Axum. And this isn't casual cultural folklore, this claim is the central pillar of Ethiopian civilization. The story begins with the Queen of Sheba. She travels to Jerusalem, meets King Solomon, and returns to Ethiopia carrying his son, Menelik I. Years later, a grown Menelik visits his father. Solomon offers him the throne of Israel. Menelik refuses, but he doesn't leave empty-handed. According to the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's royal chronicle, Menelik and his companions executed what may be history's greatest heist, replacing the Ark in the Holy of Holies with a replica and quietly carrying the original back to Africa. The biblical descriptions of the Ark are not those of a decorative religious object. They describe something that incinerated armies, struck people dead if they touched it incorrectly, and released fire that couldn't be naturally explained. The effects, when read in detail, sound uncomfortably close to radiation exposure, which is why what happens to the Ark's guardian today is so difficult to dismiss. Only one man at a time holds the role of guardian. He is chosen. He enters the chapel and he never leaves again for the rest of his life. Visitors who have observed these guardians over the years report a consistent pattern: deteriorating eyesight, cataracts, skin that pales over time, and early death. These are not the symptoms of spiritual devotion, these are the symptoms of prolonged exposure to something that emits energy. If the Ark is simply a wooden box covered in gold, none of that makes any sense. And empires throughout history sensed that. The Knights Templar traveled to Ethiopia in the 12th century, specifically hunting for it. Their carved symbols still exist inside the stone churches of Lalibela. They weren't looking for a religious artifact, they were looking for a source of power. Ethiopia held firm, and Ethiopia alone among all African nations was never colonized. When Italy invaded with modern weapons in 1896, they were crushed at the Battle of Adwa. Locals speak of a light on the battlefield that turned the tide. History records it as a military miracle. Ethiopians remember it differently. And nowhere does Ethiopia's ancient power become more physically undeniable than in the churches of Lalibela. In the 12th century, King Lalibela didn't commission the construction of 11 churches, he commissioned their excavation, because these churches weren't built up from the ground, they were carved down into solid volcanic rock. Entire cathedrals with windows, doors, columns, interior chambers, and sophisticated drainage systems, all cut from a single continuous piece of stone. This is not a technique that forgives mistakes. You cannot undo a wrong cut. You cannot patch a cracked column. Every decision has to be correct the first time, which means the entire three-dimensional structure of each church had to be perfectly visualized before a single chisel made contact with the rock. Modern structural engineers have studied these buildings and reached a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. To carve all 11 churches using period-appropriate hand tools would require approximately 40,000 skilled workers and well over a century of continuous labor. The project is attributed to a 24-year window. And there is another problem. The millions of tons of volcanic rock that were removed during excavation, it simply isn't there. No debris field, no quarry dump, no evidence of where it went. The monks have always had an explanation. Human workers carved during the day. At night, angels descended and continued the work, moving twice as fast, using what the ancient accounts describe as tools of light that pass through solid rock without friction. Tools of light. In 2024, we would call that directed energy, laser technology. The idea is no longer as absurd as it once seemed. Some researchers propose that the Ark of the Covenant, which Ethiopian tradition places in active use during this period, may have served as the power source. Accounts from other ancient cultures, including those of Mesoamerica and Egypt, reference methods of softening stone using acoustic frequencies or specific chemical processes. If such technology existed in Ethiopia, it would explain Lalibela completely. The most famous of the 11 churches is the Church of St. George. It is shaped as a perfect cross, carved straight down into the earth until the roof sits at ground level. You stand above it and look down into it. The geometry is flawless. The drainage system carved into its base has kept the interior dry through 800 years of seasonal flooding. That engineering alone would be remarkable for a modern construction team. In the 12th century, it was almost inexplicable. Beneath the entire complex runs a network of pitch-black tunnels. Candidates for the priesthood are sent into these tunnels alone, in complete darkness, to navigate by touch and sound, chanting as they go. It is a sensory deprivation ritual built from stone, the theology of the Book of the Covenant running through the architecture. You must walk through the darkness before you earn the light. Recently, 3D laser scans of the site revealed hollow chambers beneath the floors that have not been opened in 8 centuries. The priests say these spaces contain the treasury of the saints, gold, manuscripts, perhaps the tools used in the original construction. No one has been permitted to open them. King Lalibela spent time in Jerusalem before the city fell to siege. His vision was to build a new Jerusalem in Africa, beyond the reach of conquest, beyond the politics of empire. He named the river running through the town the River Jordan. He carved the Star of David, the Christian cross, and the ancient solar swastika, a symbol of the sun that predates Nazi corruption by thousands of years, all into the same walls. He was building a fusion, a preservation of everything sacred from every direction, encoded in stone that would last forever. While European cathedrals were bombed flat during the World Wars, Lalibela stood untouched. It still stands today. But Lalibela, the Ark, the 81 books, they all point back to one thing, a bloodline, the hidden bloodline. In Western Christianity, Jesus stands alone, no descendants, no continuing family line. The story ends at the cross and picks back up in heaven. But in Ethiopia, that idea is culturally incomprehensible. Family is not peripheral to identity, family is identity. Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty ruled for nearly 3,000 years from approximately 900 BC until 1974, one unbroken royal lineage. The last emperor, Haile Selassie, was the 225th ruler in that chain, officially titled the Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah. That is not a poetic honorific, it is a legal, genealogical, and theological claim, a direct line to King David himself. Follow that lineage carefully, and it doesn't just connect Ethiopia to the Old Testament, it creates a genealogical overlap with the New Testament that mainstream Western theology has no comfortable way to address. If Mary, the mother of Jesus, belonged to the house of David, and Ethiopia's royal dynasty traced the same bloodline for millennia, then the connection between Ethiopia and Christ wasn't theological, it was familial, literal family. This is why Rastafarianism, born in the early 20th century, identified Haile Selassie as the returned Messiah. The book of Revelation describes the returning lion of the tribe of Judah. Selassie bore that exact title. He never claimed divinity himself, but he understood with complete clarity what that ancestry meant. Then modern genetics entered the conversation. DNA studies of Ethiopian populations have identified ancient genetic markers from the Levant, specifically from the region of modern Israel and Syria, dating back approximately 3,000 years, a real migration, real people who actually moved from Jerusalem into Ethiopia, not in legend but in biology. The oral traditions turned out to be genetic history. This also explains why Ethiopian Christianity looks so fundamentally different from its Western counterpart. The Saturday Sabbath, kept. Circumcision on the 8th day, kept. Detailed dietary laws, kept. The Ethiopian Church didn't adopt Jewish practice. It never abandoned it because it was never entirely separate from it, which makes the most radical idea in this entire story suddenly uncomfortably worth considering. If Jesus survived the crucifixion, which certain ancient texts quietly suggest, and if he needed to disappear to somewhere completely safe, where better than a kingdom ruled by his own extended bloodline, a nation that had already proven it would guard sacred things with its life. In the remote highlands of Ethiopia, oral traditions passed down through generations speak of a mysterious teacher who arrived from the north, a healer, a man of extraordinary peace who spoke in a way that people had never heard before. They do not call him Jesus. They call him the righteous teacher, and no one in all the centuries since has been able to explain who he was. As the monks of Ethiopia say, the West has the water, we have the well, and now, after 2,000 years of silence, the well is finally being opened. Why now? Ask yourself a question that most people haven't thought to ask. Why now? Why are these texts suddenly everywhere after surviving in near total secrecy for 2 millennia? For centuries, these manuscripts sat in mountain monasteries, wrapped in goatskin, guarded by men who had taken lifelong oaths to protect them. They survived insect damage, military invasions, regime changes, and the collapse of empires. The monks who guarded them were not maintaining a library, they were maintaining a seal. And then, in the span of just a few years, everything breaks open. Unauthorized translations begin circulating online. The algorithm amplifies them. Millions of people who had never heard of the Mashafa Kidan are suddenly watching videos about it between news updates and social media scrolling. You are watching one right now. That is not an accident. The most extreme reading of the Ethiopian texts themselves offers a chilling explanation. The Mashafa Kidan describes the end times as an age of webs of illusion. In the original Ge'ez language, the description translates to a world that is hyper-connected but fundamentally false, where people communicate without physical voices and perceive without physical eyes, a world that is all signal and no truth. Read that again slowly and tell me it doesn't describe the internet, social media, and the early stages of artificial intelligence with unsettling precision. The theory is this: the Ethiopian monks were not simply preserving scripture, they were guarding an emergency manual, a set of instructions specifically designed to be released at a particular threshold moment in human history, and the trigger condition was the exact world we are now living in. The prophecy states that when humanity becomes lost inside manufactured realities, the hidden truth must be released to break the illusion. Look at where we are. Trust in governments has collapsed. Trust in the media has collapsed. Faith in organized religion is declining at historic speed. People are not hungry in the conventional sense. They are starving for something they cannot name, a direct connection to something real, something unmediated, something that doesn't require an institution standing between them and the truth. That is precisely what these texts offer, and that is precisely why they spread the way they do. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which standardized the Western biblical canon, did not simply simplify the scriptures for a broader audience. According to the logic embedded in the Ethiopian texts, it performed a targeted disarmament. The books that were removed weren't removed because they were historically unreliable. They were removed because they described human beings as powerful, spiritually autonomous agents in a cosmic conflict, beings with access to direct knowledge of God that required no priestly intermediary. By removing those books, the institution removed the reader's armor. Ethiopia never accepted that removal. They kept the full text, while the rest of the world received the edited version. And some sections of the manuscripts don't read like theology at all, they read like physics. Researchers have identified passages that describe what we would now recognize as acoustic levitation, the manipulation of physical matter using precisely directed sound frequencies. Look at Lalibela. Look at what was built. Look at what the legends say about how it was built. If you replace the word angels with the phrase advanced acoustic technology, suddenly nothing about those churches is unexplainable. If those systems are documented in the Book of the Covenant, and if current translations are beginning to reveal how they functioned, then this is not simply a religious awakening. This is the return of a pre-flood science that was deliberately buried. So here is the question that should stay with you long after this video ends. If the most powerful institutions in history edited the past to maintain control over the present, what else is still being hidden? And if an elderly Ethiopian monk on the last night of his life chose to pass on a secret he had guarded for decades, what does that tell you about how urgent the truth has become? The seal is broken. The texts are out. The only question remaining is whether the world is ready to read them. If this opens something in your thinking, hit like and subscribe, because there is significantly more of this story that has never been told, and the next chapter is even deeper.